On today's show here in late August, we'll dig into the mailbag and your questions. For the most part on today's podcast, the World Cup, extension talk, even what the concept of a world champion might be. We'll get into all of that and more on the way.
You are Locked On Hawks, your daily Atlanta Hawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 1542 of the Locked On Hawks podcast. I'm your host, Brad Rowland, coming to you on a Monday evening here in late August and into Tuesday. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook of the Locked On Podcast Network. And right now, for a new customer, get bet $5, get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon right now to get started. Also want to tell you at the top of the podcast, make it your first listen each and every day. And please subscribe to the podcast anywhere you get your podcasts, places like Apple and Spotify. We're also on YouTube on the video side. And an announcement at the top of the podcast, the long-awaited Trae Young player capsule with my friend Glenn Willis and I will be dropping later on this week. I'm looking forward to that. So this is sort of the final pre-capsule episode here on a Monday evening into Tuesday. And for the most part, in fact, almost the entire show, is going to be mailbag questions. We're in the dead zone. I'll have some guests lined up, including Glenn, for 2 parts later on this week with regard to Trae Young. But for now, some mailbag questions, and I do appreciate all of them. I definitely put out a call for more of them today. If you want to send anything into the mailbag, either a question to be read on the air or anything else, you can find me at Locked On Hawks on Twitter/X or at BT Rowland on my personal account or lockedonhawks@gmail.com. And with all of that out of the way, we'll dive into your questions on today's episode 4. So I should say this. Number one of the questions on today's show comes from Josh, who says, what do you think of the Hawks guys so far in the World Cup? Patty Mills looks great from what I have seen. Keep in mind, I'm answering this Monday night, so keep that in mind when you're looking at the schedule. Australia plays again Tuesday morning, as does Angola with Bruno Fernando. So it's tough to be too timely. The sort of timelines and the windows are pretty difficult in a lot of ways. I will not claim to have watched every single second of all 3 teams that we're going to talk about briefly here. But Patty Mills, to the question, is averaging 20-plus points per game so far through 2 games, 1 win, 1 loss with Australia. If you missed it, I talked to Reed Wallach on the last episode of the podcast on Friday of last week. He's a little bit lower on Patty than I am in general, but I think we both sort of acknowledge that Patty is a very, very good FIBA player, and that's always been the case. Looks the case so far again this time around with Australia. He moves well on and off the ball. He has the ball in his hands a lot with Australia, but he's shooting the ball at a high level. He's very much more active on the ball as far as a creator than he would be in the NBA, but he's playing well so far, so good to see that. From a Hawks perspective, certainly good. You can't argue with him looking pretty good in FIBA play. I've seen a little bit less of Bruno Fernando so far, but he's averaging 14 points or so, 6 rebounds as the best player on Angola. He had a huge dunk on Jordan Clarkson against the Philippines that made the rounds on Twitter as a highlight. Also really nice assist at the end of that win over the Philippines. Good to see him playing well in general. And then Bogdanovic is the other guy, of course. He is the best player for Serbia. Serbia is a 2-0 team right now with wins over China and Puerto Rico. Bogey has not been terribly efficient so far, but he looks fine to me in what I've seen. He's much more of like the number 1 option for Serbia than most of the time that he will be in Atlanta, of course. But another guy who's a very good fit for FIBA play, good shooter, can play on the ball a little bit more, and you can sort of see him in a different light when you watch him play with Serbia. But certainly nothing bad from the Hawks guys so far through a couple of days, couple of games on the FIBA World Cup schedule, and we'll have more of this as we get going later on in the tournament if we need to. Question now from Sergio, who says, you laid out the best games to watch on the schedule, but what about the worst games to watch? When should I be planning a date night or something else other than watching Hawks basketball? First, I will always say this. People should not be obligated to watch every single game. Certainly, you are more than free to do so, but there should be no shaming for people that are not watching all 82 games. It is what it is. Not everyone can do that. I have to watch all of them and all of them more than once, but that's the life that I've chosen. Nobody has to do that. I know a lot of diehards do, and I certainly tip my cap to you on all of that. But just like the list of things that I would be circling that I gave you a couple of weeks ago on the podcast, it's a very objective list. It's all about schedules and all that stuff too. So to each their own. But I picked 5 games that I would say are the least appealing that I could see, either due to the actual matchup or the timing or the time slot, combination of all of that and more. So this is an order. None of these games are actually early in the season, which wasn't on purpose, but it's kind of maybe it's because everybody will still be feeling fresh at that point in time. But the first one I will highlight as a game to potentially skip over will be Saturday, January 13th against Washington. Now, that's actually mid-home stay. It's a home game. It's a Saturday, but it's a back-to-back. It's a second time back-to-back. MLK Day is 2 days later for a national TV game, and crowds are always good on the weekends, so I'm sure it'll be a pretty good atmosphere still on a Saturday. But I want to give you at least one Saturday or a couple of Saturdays to kind of maximize the date night part of that question. NFL playoffs happening as well. Not a great opponent with the Wizards, who have, I believe, one of the lowest projected win totals this year. So that's one to circle, let's just say. In the middle of the homestand, and a big game on Monday after that, a better game the day before, etc. And that's where I'm going with that one. Another one sort of in the same realm is Saturday, February 10th against the Rockets. Same premise in some ways. It's a back-to-back with travel from Philadelphia back to Atlanta. So maybe a game that guys might rest in, for instance. Super Bowl's the next day, so kind of a big weekend in the football world, all that stuff too. It could be parties or whatever. Houston won't be awful this year, but it's a game that's not going to be like a headline-grabbing matchup necessarily on a Saturday, so there you go on that. And the last three games that I listed are actually all Wednesdays. That wasn't on purpose, but it's kind of the way this all broke down. One of them is 4 days later, Wednesday, February 14th against Charlotte. Yes, it's Valentine's Day. That is part of why I'm saying this. I'm sure a lot of people will have plans that evening. And automatically, that's one to kind of maybe give back to your significant other. That will help you in certain ways. It's also not a great game. It's the Hornets. They're not going to be great necessarily this year. The Hawks see them 4 times. So, yeah, I would say this is probably number one on the list overall because it's a holiday adjacent evening at least, and not a great matchup on a Wednesday. So that's one to give back if you don't want to watch all 82 this year. March 13th against Portland on the list. The saving grace here could be that Georgia's own Scoot Henderson is on the team for Blazers. And I will say this was the last pick I made, so this is not exactly a slam dunk on the list. But I wanted to do one late game to give folks some sleep, and this is going to be a late one. Portland's not going to be great this year, I don't think. It's a 10 o'clock game on a Wednesday. It's also the first game of a long West Coast trip. So if you want to try to get a lot of basketball in that week, it can be not a lot of sleep going on. And maybe that first one is the one to miss if you want to go ahead and do that. And then lastly on this list, Wednesday, April 3rd against Detroit. I always say this, but March and April, it's not quite the same in the NBA. It's kind of the dog days. Everyone kind of knows it around the league, players, coaches, staffers, etc. Teams might be tanking by then, i.e. the Pistons. Guys are resting up for the playoffs. And this game is not going to be a great one necessarily on paper. I am pretty high on Cade Cunningham, and Detroit could be okay this year. But by April, they might be out of it. And it's a Wednesday, about a week before the end of the season. Not a lot going on in the sports world at that point in time. It's also like Final Four week. So all that stuff, like a lot going on there, but it is what it is. And one bonus one that I will add at the end of this answer, I almost included April 10th against Charlotte on the list. Now, I already included one on Charlotte, and also that's the home finale. So that's why I didn't put it on the list. But if the Hawks are in the playoffs and comfortably in the playoffs by that point, and we already know they're going to have at least one more or two more guaranteed home games, I would probably add this one because, again, Charlotte might be out of it. It's the last game. It's kind of a bad spot in some ways, and kind of a play out the string. Might have guys resting, etc. There's usually at least one game a year in April that's just like unwatchable. Last year was the Boston game. That was game 82 when no one played for the Hawks. That might be the case in that Charlotte game, but anyway, hopefully that answers the question. And again, this is all about personal preference, but I'm fully aware that most people, I would say the vast majority of people, do not watch all 82 games. Even when I am unable to watch live, I am required to watch all the games for obvious reasons. But shouts to everybody else that wants to dial in, and no shame taking a game or two off over the course of the season. Okay, we'll have more questions from the mailbag in a second. But first, a word from our sponsors on today's podcast. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel, and get ready for the NFL season right now with incredible offers from FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, if you're a new customer, bet $5, get $200 back in bonus bets guaranteed with FanDuel. Plus, all customers who bet at least $5 will get $100 off NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV this year. FanDuel has point spreads, over-unders, money lines, player props, futures, and much more. The FanDuel app is also safe and secure. They cover the whole range of sports across the board. That includes the NFL, of course. College football is already up and running now. NBA, MLB, WNBA, college basketball, golf, tennis, soccer, auto racing, and much more. And now is the best time to join FanDuel. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon right now. Kick off the NFL season with an offer that you won't want to miss. Again, that's bet $5 to get $200 off. Sorry, $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official partner of the NFL. All right, question now from Xavier, who says, what do you think of the Noah Lyles controversy on whether NBA champions should be called world champions? So I have to be honest, I kind of missed this discourse the first time around. I had to look it up. I'm trying to be a little bit less online in the offseason, but it is what it is. People that may not know this, basically Noah Lyles is on the USA track team, and I have no idea why it even came up, but he kind of a mini rant thing about how the NBA calls its champion, the world champion. And he said, like, world champion of what? The United States, ? etc. Got a lot of attention. It's August. That's very important. Not a ton happening right now. Plus, he got dunked on by Kevin Durant and Aaron Gordon and others across the NBA. On one hand, to answer the question, I can kind of see what he's saying because 29 of the 30 teams in the NBA are in the U.S. The other one's in Canada, of course, with Toronto. That's a little bit odd on the surface to say world champion of a league that's based in basically one country for the most part. But if you actually use a bit of common sense here and just kind of a knowledge of the sport and kind of the landscape, the NBA champion would be the world champion, just pretty clearly in a lot of ways. The NBA champion would be, let's just say, a 30, 40-point favorite over a team from somewhere else, basically. So in some sports, the talent is much more spread out around the globe. Like soccer comes to mind. And there are obviously top-tier soccer leagues, but there's more than one. You could say the EPL is the best or whatever, but there are more than one league that might have declaimed to something like the top spot. In basketball, all of the top players in the world are in the NBA without exception. There is sometimes a guy or two that I would call like top 100 guys in the world playing somewhere else, whether it's in EuroLeague, or maybe a guy who's just like too young. Like when Luka was in EuroLeague, he was obviously a top 100 player in the world, but still, he was 17 or 18 years old. There might be one guy at the top of the EuroLeague that's like a really good NBA player, but they're not going to be a super duper star. That just in the modern landscape, that's basically never happened, where a guy who was already draft eligible age was just wanting to play somewhere else that was really like a top 50 player in the league. No one really does that. So if we can be adults, teams in Europe and South America or Australia or somewhere else would have basically no chance, especially in the NBA. We'll use the Nuggets as the example. Basically, if you put the Nuggets on the court in June of last year when they've been playing with each other all year long, they had Jokic, who's a top 5 player in the world, Jamal Murray, etc., and they had the cohesion and the depth and all of that stuff. They would have beaten a champion in any other league. I'm very, very confident about that. Now, the gap has closed in terms of international competition. Like that, 30 years ago, the U.S., when the Dream Team was running around, they were just blasting everyone. That isn't the case anymore, which is certainly worth pointing out the difference there. The most talented team in the World Cup is the U.S. by a pretty wide margin, but there are teams that can beat them for sure in the World Cup. And, there isn't the same level of cohesion at the top levels of the international thing. Like the U.S. team, they do a training camp or whatever, but they're only playing a handful of games together. Like they're not on the same page like the Nuggets would be, or like the Warriors from a few years ago, et cetera. Like it is what it is, but the U.S. national team isn't playing at the same level. So talent-wise, U.S. has the edge there. But when it comes to like the club scene, which basically includes the NBA, take the Nuggets against Real Madrid or whoever the best team is from overseas, the Nuggets would be a very large favorite in a game or series in that one. So obviously there's some nitpicking here, and I get it on some level, but that's all this really is. The world champion thing is maybe a little bit corny, but it's also just true in the way that this kind of breaks down at this point in time in basketball. Not always the case in other sports, but in basketball, it does make a lot of sense in some ways. Question now from Steven, who says, this is not a Hawks question necessarily, but although maybe it could be, what is your favorite NBA awards bet right now? There are a couple that seem too good to be true for me. Now, he didn't list those that he thinks are too good to be true, so maybe I found them, maybe I didn't. We'll see. I'm gonna do probably a FanDuel deep dive on the Hawks stuff later on in the summer, or maybe next month. But as a reminder, FanDuel is the partner of this podcast and the Locked On Podcast Network as our official sportsbook partner. So I'm looking at the odds there. I think, honestly, it's going to sound very square, and I get that. I think my favorite bet might be Jokic at plus 430 to win the MVP award. Now, he didn't win it last year, So the voter fatigue element, which was probably out there a lot last year, probably won't be there as much this year. He's incredibly durable. He's guaranteed to put up preposterous numbers when he plays. I don't love betting the favorite, but just to break it down for you, Jokic has to win about 20% of the time for it to be a good value to bet on him. And I think he wins it at least that often. So that's probably maybe my favorite bet in terms of just like the nuts and bolts. There are longer shots. Like I think Shea at plus 2,300 is a pretty good bet. Anthony Edwards plus 3,300 is a pretty good bet. Luka at plus 700 might be interesting. Even Trey at 60-1 to win MVP. I'm not just saying that because it's the Hawks show. I think when you're Trey and you have the capability of averaging what he could average stat-wise, the problem there is that you need the Hawks to win a lot of games. But, that's possible anyway. So I think any of those guys might be pretty interesting values at their numbers in MVP World. Further down the board, I kind of like Scoot Henderson for Rookie of the Year right now at plus 450 or so. Wembanyama is the favorite and should be, but I couldn't bet him at basically even money where he is right now. If the Blazers trade Damian Lillard, that's a big if, but if they do, I will probably like Scoot a lot in terms of at that number. Chet Holmgren is the next guy in the mix of the top three. I don't really have anybody else deeper down the board. I hate most improved player, so I'll pass that one off. Defensive player of the year, Walker Kessler is my favorite bet probably, I think, at 25-1. I don't think he's going to win it, but I think he could win it, and that's a pretty enticing number. And that's something where you kind of have to have the narrative and the numbers, and he might be able to do that. Maybe Bam as well if the Heat are good, as kind of their clear anchor at 10-1. I don't know. Bogey at sixth man of the year, 26-1, not a bad number. Karis LeVert at 29-1 on a pretty good Cavs team. Gabe Vincent as a sleeper at 42-1 on the Lakers because it's the Lakers, honestly, if he plays enough and scores some points. But that's definitely a yay stats, yay points award most of the time. Hopefully that's enough. Like if you want a desperation, most improved player bet, maybe Shaedon Sharpe would be the one that I would circle at plus 3,100. A lot of upside there. But nothing's screaming at me at this point in time. I'll probably do some more digging on this, but I looked at when I saw the question come in today, I sort of did some quick digging and nothing screamed at me, but I think Jokic is probably my favorite bet, as funny as that is, because he's the favorite, but I think he's probably the best value on the board that I could see. But I do wish that I had bet Anthony Edwards to win MVP before the World Cup started, because I think he was like 40 or 45-1 before that. I'm not saying he's going to win it, but it certainly would be pretty advantageous odds. I think he kind of fits the mold of a guy who could have that breakout that you have to have, like the real huge breakout to be an actual MVP candidate. And then you need Minnesota to win. Same thing as Trae Young. Like you have to be able to win games and have stats, and that combination can be tricky to kind of find at this point in time. All right, last question on today's podcast comes from SG, who says, Brad, can you give us the best recent comparisons for Bey and Okongwu and contract extensions? He actually said Big O. So Big O and Bey contract extensions. I talked about this a little bit earlier this summer, but I am reminded always that not everyone listens to every episode. That's important to note. And also, I didn't give really specific player contract comparisons, especially for Saddiq Bey. So as of when I'm recording this, there really isn't even a close parallel for Bey in terms of like this draft class. Okongwu does have a kind of parallel with Isaiah Stewart, who I talked about a little bit earlier this summer as well, but he signed for $464 with the Pistons. He's the only guy in the class basically who signed a deal that's not at like basically at the max. I'll be the first to say Okongwu is a better player than Stewart, and a much better prospect than Stewart. And the Hawks, though, I think will probably at least try to use this as a comp on their side. Stewart's played more minutes than Okongwu in his career, despite being in the same draft class. So actually has more counting stats as well. If you look a little bit beyond that, though, the efficiency stuff is Okongwu for sure. Defensively, Okongwu for sure. Per minute numbers, Okongwu for sure. So obviously he's a younger player, more upside, higher draft pick, etc. So I think if you're Okongwu's agent, you don't even want to entertain that comparison. The Hawks will definitely try to use it as they should. So there you go on that one. Beyond that one, though, I think if you look back a year or two and he said recent comparisons, I think Wendell Carter Jr. is not the worst comp in the world for Okongwu as far as extensions are concerned. They were sort of drafted in a very similar area in the mid-lottery, similar total minutes in the first 3 years. Carter played a lot more per game, just been playing fewer games than Okongwu. Okongwu has better efficiency numbers than Carter and has more defensive upside than Carter, but Carter had been probably seen as a little bit more proven. He played more minutes again. Important to remember also that Carter's breakout when he averaged 15 and 10 was his fourth season after the extension actually was already signed because he got traded to Orlando. So all that, keep that in mind. It's always about timing here. This is about after your third season, before your fourth season. So not a perfect comparison, but I think since the question was asked, I think the closest recent comp I could find to Okongwu would be Carter. But even then, that's 2 years ago, and the financial landscape has changed quite a bit in the league since then. For instance, he signed for 4 years, $50 million. There is no chance that he's signing that deal. I mean that Okongwu this summer. That's not happening because the cap environment is just totally different. That's probably closer to like 470 or 475 at this point in time, which is more than Stewart got, but less than I think that Okongwu would take. But that's kind of like the range that I would say and the best comp I can come up with for Okongwu in terms of recency and rookie extensions. Not perfect, but something that's kind of at least out there. Bey doesn't have one at all from this class. I think Keldon Johnson is the one that I would find for him. That's a decent one in the last year or two. That's actually from last year's group, whereas Carter was 2 years ago. Johnson was last year. The diehards may remember this. Keldon came up actually a lot when we talked about DeAndre Hunter a year ago because they were in the same draft class and he signed before Hunter did. And there was kind of a comparison point there. Johnson had actually been as good or maybe even better, especially on offense, than Hunter had been for 3 years, but was drafted 25 spots lower and didn't have the same tools that Hunter has physically and defensively. So Hunter got 4 for 90. Johnson got 4 for 74, which I argued was actually kind of based on maybe draft slot and projection more than actual production. But anyway, I think Keldon is the closest guy I could find in terms of recent comps to Bey when it comes to position, production, draft slot, etc. So Bey was drafted 19th. Johnson was 29th. So that's a decent gap there, but nothing massive. Bey has been incredibly durable so far. He's actually played a lot more minutes than Johnson had played through 3 years, but very similar counting stats, about 14 points per game, 5 or 6 rebounds per game, pretty similar on both sides there. Johnson was more efficient through 3 years by a decent clip because Bey's 2-point shooting was very, very rough in Detroit. Keep that in mind. His inside the arc game was not very good with the Pistons, but similar rebounding numbers, not great. Pretty bad defensive numbers on both for both guys at this point in time. Johnson is much more of a smaller wing type, whereas Bey is kind of bulkier, more of a combo forward, plays a little bit more at the 4, etc. Not a bad comparison though. Again, Johnson got 4 for 74 a year ago. It was a little bit less than that. That was including incentives. So it was actually about 468. But that probably translates to like 475 now, 480, something like that with the new cap jump. And it's going to be happening already. So that's probably more than I would give Bey right now if it was me because, of all the way that I feel about this. But that would be understandable in terms of the range that he might be in. I know there's some sticker shock with $20 million a year. But with the cap, with where the cap is, that's like 6th man money, 7th man money at this point in time moving forward. And that's probably what Bey projects to be in a lot of ways, like 5th starter or 6th, 7th man. That's kind of the range that he's in. The reason, though, I'll say this, I'm sure I've repeated myself a lot on this in the past, but the reason I would probably not give him that much money right now would be I don't think he's likely to get much more than that a year from now. And my philosophy generally, not firmly, but generally speaking on the team size, that is, unless it's sort of a star level player that can make you look silly and get a lot more money in the future, I'm not looking to do extensions unless they are like what I believe to be genuinely positive value contracts. If a guy signs a deal that I think is just like what he should have signed for, I probably wouldn't do that as a team. It's not terrible, but I probably wouldn't do it. Hunter's a good example. I think that's a deal that I would not have done. And I think if they would have waited, they would have been much better off. That's obviously a one-off, but I said the same thing when it happened. Like I didn't hate it. I don't think it's a disaster, but if you want to do it over again, I think that objectively speaking, the Hawks would have probably gotten him for less if they had waited a year. That isn't always the case. If the guy has a great year, if Bey goes out there and lights the world on fire, then maybe I'll look silly. But I think if it was that kind of level, 475, 4 for 80, I probably wouldn't give that. For Bey. Okongwu, I'd be more aggressive because I think he actually does have more upside and he's younger and he has more breakout potential. If Capella were to go down or be traded, suddenly if that happens in the middle of the season, Okongwu goes out and has like a fringe, all-star level season. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but that's at least in the realm of possibility, whereas with Bey, it's not really, I don't really think that's possible, or at least not likely. So anyway, those are my comparisons. They're not perfect. And again, it's very important to know, especially right now with where the cap is going, that when the deal was signed is important. A deal that happened a year ago is different than a deal that happened now, especially a deal that happened 2 years ago, like the one that Carter signed. But close comparisons, I would say Wendell Carter for Okongwu and Keldon Johnson for Bey. There are other options that are not quite as appealing. And again, Isaiah Stewart's going to come up for Okongwu, I think it's at some point. But that's where we are right now. And again, I'm not holding my breath anytime soon for these deals to get done. If they get done, most of the time, guys either get done early, i.e. right away, at the high end, or they wait until all the way into the season or close to it. It has to be done right before the season starts. And the last 2 years, they've had Kevin Huerter and DeAndre Hunter basically the last day that they were allowed to sign extensions. That's a very popular thing that happens, especially in the middle of the first round, and that could happen again for either or both of Bey and Okongwu. Okay, that's it for today's podcast. Again, I'll have more content later on this week. The plan is the 2-part player capsule with myself and Glenn Willis talking about Trae Young in a similar fashion to what we talked about the rest of the roster earlier on this summer. So stay tuned for that. Please subscribe to the podcast anywhere you get your podcasts. Also, go ahead and do that more than once if you really want to support the show. Best way to do that is to download and click around episodes and cross platforms, etc. YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, etc. Follow us on Twitter as well, /X, I suppose, at Locked On Hawks. Follow me there at BT Rowland. And thank you for listening, everybody. I really do appreciate it. We'll see you all later on this week.